On a rainy Thursday evening, Michael Harris stood in the kitchen with his hand frozen over the phone, the screen glowing in the half-dark like a tiny stage light. His wife's contact photo stared back at him. All he had to do was press call and tell her the truth, that he had just signed the papers to retire early, to walk away from the job that had defined his entire adult life. His heart pounded, his throat felt tight, and the clock above the stove ticked loudly in the background, carving time into thin, sharp slices. He told himself he was still deciding, still weighing the options, still free to change his mind. What he did not know, what none of us ever feel, is that deep inside his brain, 7 seconds earlier, the decision had already been made. Hello, dear friends. Today we are going to talk about a terrifying and liberating idea, that your brain may be choosing long before you feel you've decided. Stay with this story, and if you recognize yourself in it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your own experience in the comments. Michael Harris was 62 years old, the sort of man who had always trusted routine more than inspiration. For 37 years he had worked at the same insurance company, in the same gray building that smelled faintly of paper, toner, and old coffee. He woke every morning at 6:30 to the sound of a digital alarm he sometimes heard in his dreams, slid his feet into the same pair of worn slippers, and walked down the hallway to the kitchen, where the timer on the coffee machine had already finished its quiet work. The smell of fresh coffee filled the small, warm room, mixing with the faint scent of rain drifting in through the slightly open window. Outside, the street was still half asleep, wet pavement reflecting the orange glow of streetlights, the distant hiss of early buses passing by, a dog barking once and then falling silent. His wife, Elaine, liked to say you could set a clock by him. Same mug, same brand of cereal, same seat at the table by the window where he read the news on his phone while the sky slowly brightened through the thin curtains. On Saturdays he mowed the lawn. On Sundays they went to the same diner after church and ordered the same breakfast, black coffee for him, tea with lemon for her, 2 eggs over easy, toast, and a shared plate of pancakes for old time's sake. Their 2 daughters were grown and gone now, one living 3 states away with a family of her own, the other teaching at a college on the coast. The house, once noisy with slammed doors and teenage arguments, had settled into a gentle rhythm of 2 older people sharing space and habits, and a kind of quiet affection that did not require many words. Lately, though, something in that rhythm had started to feel off. It began as a faint restlessness he could not name. Sitting at his desk at work, surrounded by files and forms and the soft hum of fluorescent lights, Michael would stare at the screen and feel as if he were watching someone else's hands typing his password, someone else's fingers flipping through claim reports. The numbers blurred, the words on the page seemed to slide out of focus. He told himself it was just age, or maybe he needed new glasses. But then came the health scare, tightness in his chest one afternoon while he was climbing the stairs, a sudden rush of dizziness that made him grip the railing and breathe through the fear that this, finally, was the heart attack he had been told to watch out for. The tests at the hospital came back mostly fine. You need to slow down, the doctor said. Less stress, more walking, watch your blood pressure. Routine advice, the kind he had heard before. But something about hearing it this time, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and plastic and the metallic tang of fear, lodged deep inside him. The idea of retirement, which had always felt like a distant shoreline he would reach someday, drifted closer. He began to imagine mornings without alarms, afternoons without forms to sign, evenings with the weight of decisions he no longer wanted to make. And yet, whenever he thought about actually doing it, actually walking into his manager's office and saying, "I think it's time I stopped," a cold unease rose in his chest. Who would he be without the job? What would be left of him once the routine was gone? He found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft whistle of Elaine's breathing beside him, and the gentle ticking of the clock on the nightstand. Somewhere between those ticks, in the small, silent gaps, a new kind of fear took root. Not fear of death or illness or losing his home, but fear of something he could not quite put into words. The fear that the choices he believed he was making so carefully were not really his at all. The moment of rupture came on an overcast Tuesday, the kind of day that felt like it had been washed in gray water. Michael had been called into human resources to discuss options. The company was offering early retirement packages to senior employees, and his name had floated to the top of the list.
The meeting room was small and windowless, with a table that smelled faintly of cleaning spray. A folder lay in front of him, its edges too sharp, its contents too heavy. The HR representative smiled politely and explained the numbers, the benefits, the timelines, her voice smooth and practiced, as if she had repeated these lines many times already that week. He listened, nodded, asked questions he barely heard himself asking. Somewhere in the back of his mind he imagined Elaine at home, washing dishes after lunch, the sound of running water and clinking plates echoing in the kitchen, unaware that their life might be about to tilt in a new direction. The Reb slid a pin toward him. "You don't have to decide today," she said, though her eyes suggested that deciding today would be helpful. "Take your time. Think it over. Michael looked at the pen. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a simple plastic tube with a metal tip, utterly ordinary and, at this moment, unbearably heavy. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, heard the rush of blood in his ears like distant traffic. Part of him whispered, "Not yet. Think. Go home. Talk to Elaine." Another part, quieter but somehow more solid, said, "You've already made up your mind." His hand moved. Later, hours later, days later, in the weeks that followed, he would remember this moment as a slow, dramatic struggle. He would tell himself that he had hovered there for a long time, pen on the edge of the paper, suspended between two possible futures, wrestling with the decision. But in the reality of that small, airless room, his fingers closed around the pen, and his name appeared on the signature line in less than 2 seconds. A flick, a scratch of ink, the faint sound of pen against paper. Done. He walked out of the meeting with the folder under his arm, and the strange, hollow feeling of someone who had just jumped from a height and had not yet hit the ground. In the elevator, he watched the numbers descend, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and felt as if he were falling through those floors, through years of his own life. On the drive home, the sky hung low and heavy. Raindrops began to hit the windshield, slow at first and then faster, the wipers squeaking back and forth in rhythmic arcs. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as a thought rose inside him like a tide. Did I really choose this? Did I truly, consciously decide? The more he replayed the moment, the stranger it felt. He could not clearly remember the instant of choice, that precise inward yes that should have preceded his signature. Instead, it felt as if his hand had moved on its own, and his mind had rushed in afterward to explain what the hand had already done. I must have wanted it, he told himself. I wouldn't have signed if I didn't want to. But beneath that rationalization lurked a colder voice. What if the wanting came after? What if the story of why you chose is just that, a story, written too late, trying to catch up to a decision your brain had already made? That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea Elaine had poured for him, listening to the steady pattern of rain against the window, Michael tried to describe the feeling. It's like I'm watching my life from half a step behind, he said, like I only know what I've decided by looking at what I just did. Elaine squeezed his hand across the table. You thought about this for a long time, she said gently. You didn't do it on impulse.
He wanted to believe her, but somewhere deep in his chest, a thin crack had opened in his sense of himself as the author of his own choices. Through that crack, questions began to seep. In the weeks that followed, Michael moved through a world that felt slightly misaligned, like a picture hanging a little crooked on a wall. The routines of his life continued, the morning coffee, the lawn that still grew and needed cutting, the bills that arrived in the mail, but his sense of agency over those routines had shifted. He found himself watching his own actions with a new kind of detached curiosity. He would open the refrigerator and reach for the orange juice instead of the milk, and then think, when did I decide that? Did I really choose, or did my hand just go there? It was a small, unnerving thought, the kind that might have dissolved if he had simply ignored it. Instead, because Michael had always been the sort of man who tried to understand problems rather than run from them, he went looking for answers. It started with a late-night video. You know the kind. The algorithm offers you something unexpected, and curiosity clicks play before you even think about it. A neuroscientist on a stage, talking about experiments where people's brains decided before they were aware of choosing. Michael sat in the dim light of the living room, the television screen casting a cool glow over the familiar furniture, and listened as the scientist described a study from the 1980s. Volunteers were asked to press a button with their left or right hand whenever they felt like it, while their brain activity was measured. They were also asked to note the moment they became aware of deciding which hand to use. The shocking part? A specific pattern of brain activity appeared a fraction of a second, and in later studies, up to 7 seconds, before the volunteers reported the conscious decision. In other words, the brain had already begun the process of choosing, long before the person felt, I've decided. Michael replayed that section twice. 7 seconds.
He imagined his hand reaching for the pen in that small HR room, the scratch of his signature appearing on the page. 7 seconds earlier, he had still believed he was free to say no. But if the scientist was right, somewhere in his brain, the neural dominoes leading to yes had already started to fall. The next day, he went to the library, not his own company's office anymore, but the public one downtown, a place that smelled of dust and paper and quiet concentration. He checked out books on decision-making, free will, and the neuroscience of choice. Some were dense, full of technical terms he had to reread twice. Others were surprisingly clear. He learned that what the experiments were picking up, sometimes called a readiness potential, was the buildup of unconscious brain activity leading to an action. That activity started before the person became conscious of deciding. Conscious will, it seemed, might not be the initiator of action, but more like a commentator arriving late to the game, explaining moves that were already in progress. At first, this idea frightened him. If his brain was making decisions before I felt them, what did that say about free will? Was I just a passenger, watching choices bubble up from neural machinery I did not control? But the more he read, the more complicated and, in some ways, more comforting the picture became. He learned that his brain was not a single entity, but a vast network of systems, some fast and automatic, others slower and reflective. The automatic systems pulled from habits, past experiences, and emotional patterns, generating impulses and tendencies long before conscious thought entered the scene. The reflective systems, what he thought of as himself, the voice in his head that said, "I will" or "I won't," often arrived later, interpreting and sometimes vetoing those impulses. He read about how, when you reach for a cup of coffee, your brain begins the movement before you consciously think, "I'm going to pick this up." When you answer a familiar question, your mouth may start forming words before you have fully articulated the sentence in your mind. When you choose between 2 shirts in the morning, subtle biases, comfort, color, emotional associations you barely notice, nudge your hand toward one long before you tell yourself the story of why that shirt was the better choice.
One example stuck with him. Imagine you're asked to press a left or right button whenever you feel like it. Inside your brain, tiny fluctuations in activity, random noise shaped by past patterns, push the system closer to one option than the other. By the time you feel "I chose left," those unconscious processes have already set the stage. Your feeling of choice is real, but it's more like arriving at the last step of a staircase you've been walking down in the dark. Michael closed the book and stared out the library window at the parking lot glistening with recent rain. Cars pulled in and out. People made small decisions. Turn left, turn right, park here, go there. Each one feeling so immediate, so personal. And yet, inside their skulls, complex machinery was whirring away milliseconds and seconds before their awareness caught up. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. If his brain was choosing before he did, who exactly was the he that felt robbed? The turning point did not come as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow thawing, like frost melting from a window to reveal the view beneath. One morning, weeks after he had signed the retirement papers, Michael stood in his kitchen pouring coffee while rain tapped softly on the window. The house felt unusually quiet. Elaine had gone to visit their granddaughter for a few days. The digital clock on the stove glowed 7:12 in pale green numbers. He watched the dark stream of coffee fill the mug, smelled the bitter, comforting scent rise into the warm air, and felt a familiar impulse: add sugar. He froze for a second, aware of the movement before it finished. His hand had already reached halfway toward the sugar jar on the counter before his conscious thought formed. Do I really want sugar today? In that tiny pause, he noticed something. He could still stop. He left his hand hovering for a moment, then slowly pulled it back and took his coffee black. It was a trivial act, laughably small compared to signing away a career. But in that instant, something clicked. Maybe his brain had started the action without him, but he had intercepted it. The readiness potential might have been there, the unconscious momentum building, but the slower, reflective part of his mind had stepped in and said, "Not this time." He remembered something one of the authors had written, that free will might not be about initiating every choice from scratch, but about the ability to veto, to reshape, to train the automatic systems over time. Not absolute freedom, but a kind of guidance. He began to see his brain less as a puppeteer and more as a deeply loyal, sometimes overprotective assistant, one that made guesses and prepared actions based on everything it had ever learned, trying to keep him safe and efficient, often jumping ahead to save time. His conscious self arrived later, sometimes rubber stamping those preparations, sometimes sending them back for revision. The 7-second gap described in the experiments no longer felt like a theft of free will.
It felt like a preview period, a window in which something inside him could still say yes or no. And when he looked back at the day he signed the retirement papers, he saw it differently too. His brain had not ambushed him with a decision born in a single second. It had been gathering evidence for months, years really, summing up exhaustion, health scares, quiet afternoons of imagining different futures. That Tuesday in the HR office was simply the moment when all that accumulated weight tipped the scale. The idea that his brain had been deciding for me all along became less frightening when he realized that his brain was not an enemy, it was part of him. The groundwork for that signature had been laid by every sigh at his desk, every late-night conversation with Elaine, every silent wish for more time with his grandchildren. Maybe he could not point to a single pure instant of choice, but the decision was woven through 1,000 small moments of living.
Months passed. Retirement settled onto Michael's life not as a sudden emptiness, but as a different kind of routine. He walked in the mornings now, the cool air on his face, the smell of wet earth and cut grass rising from the ground. He started cooking more, experimenting with recipes that left the kitchen warm and fragrant with garlic and herbs. He visited his grandchildren and let them drag him into games on the living room floor. But the question of free will never entirely left him. It showed up in small, ordinary moments. Standing in the supermarket aisle, looking at 2 brands of cereal, he would feel his hand begin to move toward the familiar box before his mind caught up. Sometimes he let it happen. Other times he paused and deliberately chose the other one, just to remind himself that he could. When he snapped at Elaine in irritation and heard the sharpness in his own voice, he could almost feel the chain of tiny, earlier triggers that had nudged him toward that outburst: tiredness, hunger, an email that had annoyed him hours before. He still regretted the harsh words, still apologized, but he no longer saw the anger as coming from nowhere. It was an impulse prepared in the background, one he might catch sooner next time. He noticed how often people around him spoke as if they were wholly in control. "I just decided. I could have chosen differently. I followed my heart." And yet, in quiet moments, those same people would confess feeling swept along by habits, urges, and reactions they did not understand. Instead of making him feel powerless, the realization that his brain started many processes before conscious awareness gave Michael a new kind of compassion for himself and for others. Everyone was wrestling with machinery they only partly saw. On nights when he lay awake listening to the rain and the slow, steady ticking of the clock, the fear that had once haunted him, the fear of losing his free will, softened into something else. He imagined his brain working in the dark like a careful librarian after closing time, sorting through memories, updating patterns, preparing tomorrow's probable choices. He could not control every flicker of neural activity, every readiness potential rising 7 seconds before he felt "I choose." But he could choose what stories to tell about those impulses. He could choose what he fed his brain, what habits he repeated, what values he tried to live by, knowing that tomorrow's automatic decisions would grow from today's repetitions. Free will, he realized, was not a single moment of pure, untouched decision. It was a long, slow shaping. A year after that rainy Tuesday when he signed away his job, Michael Harris stands at his kitchen window, watching the late afternoon lights spill like honey across the backyard. Elaine is humming softly in the next room, folding laundry. Somewhere down the street, a dog barks, and the smell of someone's dinner drifts faintly through the open window, onions maybe, and something frying in oil. On the counter beside him lies a simple notepad with a list: call Anna, schedule checkup, walk after dinner. He does not remember the exact moment he decided to write those things down. He only knows that his hand picked up the pen at some point, that his brain prepared the action, and his conscious mind nodded along. Once, that realization would have disturbed him. The idea that his brain might be starting his decisions 7 seconds before he felt them would have sounded like the death of free will. Now, it feels more like knowing where the river begins, far upstream, in places you may never see, among small trickles that join and gather force long before the water reaches your town.
Your brain is not your enemy when it does this. It is a prediction machine, a survival organ, trying to keep you moving and safe in a world that never stops demanding choices. It guesses, it prepares, it nudges, and then you, the conscious storyteller living in the middle of that storm of activity, step in and say yes, or no, or maybe next time. So here is the question for you, dear listener. How many of your sudden decisions were really years in the making? How many of your regrets come from judging yourself for choices you never fully understood? Share your story in the comments. Like this video if you've ever felt your hand move before you decided. And subscribe, because next time we'll explore another unsettling truth, how your brain sometimes creates the feeling of certainty first, and only later finds a reason to justify it.